continue to be open for a couple more weeks as we continue to have these virtual public meetings. We are just relying on virtual public meetings at this point, with the hope that later on in the process we can start to engage more in person. I think Rick mentioned this a little bit, but just as we kick off, just if you could try to keep yourself muted, except when you actually intend to speak, so that some of the barking dogs and children can be kept to a minimum, although they're welcome too. I mentioned that you can include your comments and questions in the chat at any time. Rick, feel free to interrupt me so that I can try to address those, because I won't always see them on my screen. And then we'll definitely pause a couple of times to answer questions and have some discussion. So I know that there's a mixture of folks joining us this evening with different exposure to Dart and familiarity with Dart. So I'll try to be brief, and please feel free to, again, to ask any questions. But really, Dart is our regional transit provider, focusing on providing a few different service types. Our primary service is what we call fixed route. And those are the big buses that operate on a set time and a set schedule. We also have a commuter van pool service that we call rideshare, that focuses on long distance commuters and actually extends beyond even our 12-member communities out throughout central Iowa. And lastly, we have our paratransit service. This is a door-to-door service that we use smaller vehicles for, and is really focused on serving people with disabilities, those who aren't able to ride that fixed route network. I have a graphic there on the right showing the top 5 reasons that people ride Dart. The biggest reason that people use Dart is to get to work. And that's really, all types of jobs we see. We do survey our customers on a fairly regular basis. We also know that people use Dart to get to medical appointments, shopping, further their education. And all of this, I think, contributes to our economy thriving here in central Iowa. This is a map of the 12 Dart member communities, and just showing our bus routes and some of our on-call zones. So as you can see, the span of Dart is pretty wide. It stretches, pretty far out into many member communities. As we'll get into a little bit in this discussion, not all bus routes are created equal. Some of these bus routes only operate during certain times of the day, certain days of the week, and some of them operate much more frequently. And so we'll get into some of the reasons behind that, but I just wanted to touch on the scale of Dart. Tonight, we are focusing specifically on the communities of Clive, Windsor Heights, and West Des Moines, so that we can dive a little bit deeper into some of the opportunities and challenges with transportation in these communities, and hopefully be able to have a lively discussion with residents and representatives. We've done surveys in the past, and we get customer requests on a fairly frequent basis. And here's a list of some of the top things that get requested. A lot of it comes down to people trying to get where they need to go more quickly, and to serve additional areas. Certainly we recognize that we have less service on the weekends, and that tends to be something that people ask for, as well as later night service, especially as we think about jobs that operate on shifts, and how our service comes to an end at about 11:30 on weekday evenings. A couple of years ago, we did I guess it was 2016, the last time we did a big public outreach and survey effort. And when we collected that information, we saw those trends that I showed on the previous slide. We took action, and this is just an abbreviated list of some of the things we've been up to over the last 2 years to enhance our service. The top 2 for us were really being able to provide service earlier in the morning. Some of our routes start as early as 4:30, so that we can get people to work by 6. We've also provided more midday service, recognizing that not everybody commutes between 7 and 9, and that there's plenty of folks who need to get where they need to get throughout the middle of the day, especially on weekdays. And so we're able to increase service on our busiest routes to do that. We've also expanded several routes, mostly through grants or through partnerships with businesses to serve some of those job sites, such as the Hy-Vee Commissary in Ankeny, such as the Amazon Fulfillment Center in Bondurant, as well as serve some additional housing density, dense housing locations. A couple things I'll call attention to for this group, since we are focusing on a few member communities, is in 2019 we expanded Route 72. We kind of realigned the route. That's the route that loops around West Des Moines and Clive on University, and we expanded it down to cover Mills Civic. And that was really in an effort to connect folks living along Mills Civic to some of those destinations in Valley Junction, up on University, or over at Jordan Creek. Since we did that, we did see ridership increase, and actually, as I'll get to later, Route 72 was one of the routes that actually saw the least decrease during the pandemic. So that was helpful for us to understand the importance of that route. The other thing that I'll draw your attention to is that purple square there. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it says Flex Connect Zone. That's our partnership with Uber and Yellow Cab, where we actually discontinued a DART route that used to be in that area. It's mostly covering Urbandale, but it's just across the street from Clive on the southern border of Hickman. Or sorry, the southern border of the zone is Hickman, the northern part of Clive. But that zone was our opportunity to test a concept where we replaced a DART route with the opportunity for customers to get an Uber or a Yellow Cab and ride it to bus stops, so that they were still DART customers, still getting on a DART bus, but we were using Uber and Yellow Cab for that transfer as opposed to a DART vehicle. And that pilot has been relatively successful. We'll talk about how we might try to emulate that. In addition to those service enhancements, we've been focusing on our technology and our vehicles. In the upper left there, I show our electric buses. We have 7 electric buses that are in service now, and we're studying whether switching to electric could not only be cleaner, of course, but also potentially have lower life cycle costs than our standard diesel buses. We also are buying slightly smaller diesel buses. That bus on the upper right is a bus that's about 10 feet shorter than our typical heavy-duty diesel bus. The idea there being that by having a shorter bus, we had a little bit of a smaller upfront cost and some fuel savings. And so when we think about routes, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, we really try to tailor our service to the demand. Well, same thing with the vehicles. We can tailor our vehicle size to the demand as well. And then on the bottom are just some of our customer-facing technologies and amenities. We upgraded all our fare boxes to increase the types of ways that we accept payment on board, as well as launched our MyDART app, which has booking, trip planning, and payment features all right there on an app. As we think about the future, there's a couple of key challenges that I want to highlight, and we'll talk more about this throughout the presentation. The first is that, of course, our region is growing. By some estimates, we could reach 1 million in population over the next 20 years. That growth is happening throughout the region. We have seen growth in and around Des Moines and around downtown, but also in all our member communities, including the member communities that we're focusing on this evening. So one of the key things that we want to think about is what is DART's response to that growth need to be? As we grow outward, does DART need to grow outward to meet those needs? Or is there also other services that we can bring into the mix in order to serve the evolving needs of the region? Secondarily, of course, is funding. We always have to keep our resource constraints in mind. And so, when we think about the DART's primary source of funding is local property taxes. We do receive a fair amount of federal revenue and state revenue, but our main source of funding is local property taxes. And so we want to be responsible with those property taxes and also look at possibly diversifying and trying to come up with new and different revenue streams to support the services that we know our region needs. Our region is evolving, but the transportation industry is also evolving. More and more people are seeking active transportation like biking and walking. And also we're seeing advancements in electrification of fleets, such as electric cars, electric bikes, electric scooters, as well as the shared economy. Things like a ride share, Uber and Lyft, scooter share, bike share, even car share in other regions. I don't think we quite have that yet here. But all of this is a trend towards diversification and customers and consumers wanting more options. And so as we think about the future of transit, we really want to think about how can we tailor what we offer to the needs of our residents. So we are launching this long-term planning study really focused on doing the most with the resources and the service that we already have, but also evolving to meet the needs of the region and focusing in particular on some of those innovative services that I mentioned, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in this presentation. This is a quick overview of the process. So we've been doing some existing conditions analysis. I'm going to share some of that with you. And really right now we're focusing on public input. We want to hear from as many customers, residents, business owners as we can. I mentioned our survey that we have on ridedart.com/plan. It's actually 3 different surveys. We have, depending on which profile, you fall into, we're really tailoring the information that we collect to a couple of different groups, people who ride Dart, people who don't ride Dart, business owners, so that we can try to get different perspectives on how we can best serve our region. So all that analysis and public input is going to go into drafting some recommendations over the summer. We'll come back out for public output in the fall with the goal of having a final plan by the end of the calendar year. So now I'm going to just run through some more of those existing conditions, and then we'll pause and be able to discuss. When we think about existing conditions, I want to talk about the service especially. As I mentioned before, not all bus routes are created equal, and we do tailor our services to match the demand. We have some routes that operate 7 days a week, really from 4:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night. And those are our routes that are on the corridors with the most destinations, higher density of housing. And we kind of call those our core routes, right? So we're investing the most of our resources where it's generating the most ridership. But we also recognize that there's transit needs throughout the region. So we have other classes of service as well. Our coverage routes really just focus on weekdays, and they might not even operate all day. They might just be during commute hours. And that's our way of providing access to communities and neighborhoods that maybe don't quite have the level of demand to demand that all day access or that 7-day-a-week access, but still have a fair transit need. Similarly, our express routes are really focused on long distance commuters where we have limited bus stops. They usually use the freeway to travel into downtown Des Moines. And they also have park and rides so that people can drive their car, park, and hop on Dart. And then lastly, we have our on-call service. This is more of a door-to-door service that is done by calling Dart a day ahead of time. I'll show the map again that has the zones where we provide that on-call service. But it's really very limited. Our on-call services are mostly limited to just some days of the week and some hours of the day, really just focusing on those folks who need help running errands, medical appointments, etc. So here's a map of our bus routes with ridership being shown. I'm going to zoom in the next slide a little bit closer on Clive, Windsor Heights, and West Des Moines, so we can talk about that. But first off, I just wanted to note, some of the ridership patterns. We do see more ridership in the central part of our region, in and around Des Moines. A lot of that has to do with, as I mentioned, those busy corridors with dense housing, major destinations where we get the most ridership. So we focus our resources there. But even as you spread out throughout the region, you'll see those blue circles, those pockets of ridership at commercial centers, at park and ride locations, locations where multiple routes intersect, where people are transferring. And so you'll see that each route kind of has its different patterns where it may get higher ridership just at certain locations, or some of them have ridership kind of sprinkled all along the route. And a lot of that has to do with the land use, how walkable is it, demographics of the area. I will note, you'll see in the bottom left that this data is from 2019. So this is a snapshot pre-pandemic. We chose to use pre-pandemic data because, of course, like a lot of things, the last year has been very different for transit. We have seen ridership decline by about half at the peak of the pandemic. We are climbing back out of that now, but we thought it was important to really have a snapshot before the pandemic and talk about how do we get back to there, and how do we also evolve based on some of the trends that we've seen during the pandemic, which I'll get to. So here's that little closer up snapshot of what's happening with the routes and the ridership in Clive, Windsor Heights, and West Des Moines. I'll start off with a couple of things to note. One thing is that in Clive in particular, a lot of the routes are really east to west. That has to do, or well, I'll say like the main route. There are lines that go north to south, but the one that cuts through most of Clive is that east to west route on Hickman. That has to do with our routes really, most of our routes being set up to kind of come in and out of Des Moines. They call it a hub and a spoke model, where Des Moines is the hub and each of the routes is a spoke. And that's really a relic of commuter patterns, of historical commute patterns where, most people were commuting into Des Moines for work and living out in other communities. We know that that's changing, and that's probably even been accelerated by the pandemic. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's one thing to draw attention to. The other thing I'll note about Clive is that, you see that biggest circle out. That's the park and ride at 156th and Hickman. And we appreciate the city of Clive working with us as that property changed hands and became a Nebraska Furniture Mart. They made sure that that park and ride could stay there, and that we have great communication with the new property owners to maintain access for our customers. So we appreciate that. The other thing I'll note is, as you get into Windsor Heights, you start to see more kind of medium-sized bus stops. That has to do with, I think, bus stops that are a little bit more walkable, right? So as opposed to a reliance on park and rides, more people are walking to the bus stops in Windsor Heights. The biggest example of that is the Walmart there. You see the biggest dot in Windsor Heights just below the G and the H. That's the node at Walmart, where it's one of our highest ridership locations outside of the city of Des Moines. Of course, many people going there to run their errands. As we move into West Des Moines, we see a lot more routes. Now, most of those routes are express routes that really are just operating during peak hours. But we do have 2 routes that operate 7 days a week. Route 52 goes between Jordan Creek and it hits Valley West Mall and then goes into Des Moines via the freeway. And then Route 72, which does a loop around University and Mill Civic, serving Valley Junction and Jordan Creek. So you see a mix of different kind of ridership patterns, some bigger activity, of course, over around Jordan Creek, around Valley West, around the Walmart in West Des Moines, but also a fair amount of ridership over in Valley Junction, especially again that pattern of more moderate ridership at several different bus stops as opposed to one big node of ridership. Again, probably indicating that more people are walking as opposed to driving to that bus stop. I'm going to do one more slide and then we're going to pause for comments, because I bet I want to collect more observations from you all and things. So we have analyzed that ridership data that I showed you. We've looked at census data, demographics. We've looked at land use, both existing today and projected growth into the future. And a couple of key themes have really risen to the top for us as we look at this. And this is what I really want us to discuss and for you all to react to. The first is the need for better connection between housing and jobs, especially as we think about, remember that historical commute pattern isn't necessarily holding anymore. Not everybody's coming in and out of Des Moines for work. And especially as we think about people who might be heading out to Clive, Windsor Heights, and West Des Moines for work, as more and more jobs are located there. How do we, potentially need to reorient the transit system so that it's serving folks who are commuting into these communities and not just folks who live there and are trying to commute into Des Moines. The other thing is that, again, people aren't just traveling in and out of Des Moines. There's a lot of kind of cross-regional traffic. I mentioned that, that main route through Clive is really going east and west. well, what's the connection like to get to West Des Moines, or even to get to the Walmart in Windsor Heights? It's pretty limited, or it requires transfers. And so how do we potentially look at innovative, flexible alternatives that could be more responsive to the people's changing travel patterns? And then lastly is that growth question that I raised at the top. As we grow, especially as we grow outward, thinking about how Clive is growing west and north, and how Des Moines, West Des Moines is there's a lot of growth happening south and west, both in terms of housing and jobs and institutions. How do we serve that? What is the best model for transit? Who needs to access those places? And how do we serve them best? Those are the things that we're thinking about as part of this study. Oh, sorry, I thought I was done. I have one more slide. I mentioned COVID. So a lot of the data we looked at was pre-COVID, but of course we recognize that COVID did change things. Want to note that while ridership was down about 50%, it wasn't down 50% everywhere. Some routes were affected more than others. Some days of the week were affected more than others. We did see ridership on the weekdays maintain the strong, ridership on the weekends maintain the strongest. And we had more of a dip on the weekdays. That's probably, as you think about it, people working from home, especially people who work weekdays, working from home, whereas people maybe who work on the weekends or need to get out and run their errands on the weekends, those essential workers, people who rely on DART to run their errands, still utilizing DART. Just when we think about next steps, the planning process, it can be really technical. I mentioned a lot of those inputs that we look at, but really it's just about how do we get people where they need to go? How do we get them there quickly, minimizing wait time, minimizing their travel time? Because those are really just kind of fundamental human needs. That's what anybody looks for, whether they're riding transit or driving their car or whatever. They really just want to get where they need to go as quick as possible and do so safely and comfortably. And so those are kind of some of the baseline principles that we try to apply as we're thinking about how to plan our service. The inputs to planning that service, of course, are that data analysis. I talked about some of this before, about all those things that we look at. We crunch these numbers and figure out what does our region look like today? What's it going to look like in the future? Public input, of course, the customer requests that we receive on a regular basis, surveys that we do from time to time, public meetings such as this. We also have a number of community partners and business partners that we work with to try to understand the evolving needs in the community. And so we take those inputs, of course, think about our funding constraints, and that's how we come up with what the service will look like. And that's really, the service is really, it's going to vary. It's going to vary by the type of service. I'll share some examples of that. The time of day, what we call span, how frequently it operates, where it covers, et cetera, type of vehicle we use. And so as we look to the future, as we think about evolving, we want to think about more than just the bus. Of course, the bus is going to continue to be the workhorse of public transit. There's no more efficient way to serve busy corridors. If you can get the most people possible on a single vehicle with a single driver, it doesn't get more cost effective than that. However, we know that our region has varying needs, and there's not always the demand for a full size bus. And so we want to think about how can we use smaller vehicles. Also, when do we need to deviate from having a set time and a set schedule? Have something that's more flexible, something that can be booked on demand. Now, an on-demand type of service where somebody just says, I need a ride now, let me pull out my phone, let me call DART, get that ride. That's a service that could be provided by Uber or Lyft, like we're piloting today, or it could be provided by DART using a DART vehicle and a DART driver, as shown in the lower left. When we use Uber or Lyft, there can be some cost savings there, especially when we just have very few people riding, and there can be a lot of flexibility with that, given the tools that are built into those services. But when we start to think about the range of users that we have, people who travel in a wheelchair, seniors, people for whom English is not their first language, those types of services could possibly be limiting. And that's why maybe having something that's provided by DART could also be an option in the toolbox. And then, of course, thinking about those active modes of transportation. The region already has bike share. I was happy to hear that, that Clive has recently struck an agreement to expand bike share, especially with electric bikes, which I think are really a game changer for getting people on bikes. So I think that's a good sign for our region. And so we want to think about how those types of modes can interface with transit and enhance mobility. And so it's going to take, our recommendations while we're still collecting public input. This is just a kind of the flavor of them. Of course, we're going to look at our existing bus routes. Where do we need to change our service to meet those different needs in the community? Be it, more frequent service on busier routes, realigning service to serve additional areas, especially as we think about those evolving needs. Where is housing being built? Where are jobs being located? How do we serve those folks? But then also bus stop improvements so that we can raise the quality of transit so that it is comfortable and safe and ADA accessible to ride the bus. And as well as we think about all those other modes I showed on the previous slide, how do we bring them together physically? And I think this is a good opportunity to Matt's point about Valley West Mall. When you have a node of activity like Valley West, you can have multiple modes there and just recognize that some people are traveling short distances when maybe a bike share makes the most sense. Some people are traveling, they have a car and they want to drive and park the car before they get on the bus. So you want to have what we call mobility hubs, where it brings multiple modes together in one place so that choices are convenient. And then this is just a little bit of a description of how we might incorporate some of those new emerging mobility solutions. So some could be to substitute for bus routes where there's low ridership. I mentioned, sometimes it is cheaper to buy Ubers and taxis for people if there's really are just a handful of people riding the bus. And that was the experience that we had in Urbandale with the pilot that we're running now with Uber and Yellow Cab, where we only had a handful of people riding that bus every day, and it did make sense to eliminate that bus route and replace it with another service. The other thing we can do is we can enhance access to DART's network. So not everybody can walk to their nearest bus stop. Not everybody has a car that they can drive to a park and ride. So what if we use some of these services to transport people to bus stops, right? So that maybe that Uber ride is short, but that transit trip is longer. And maybe that's the right way to balance access and costs. And then lastly is just as we think about those unmet needs, places that don't currently have transit service, or especially those places where we might be growing and where it makes sense to have a flexible transit service to meet that need, where maybe there's not quite demand for a new bus route operating on a set time and a set schedule, but be able to have something that's on demand that can be ordered just as people need it. And so I'll close with just a quick reminder about that process. We are doing public input now. This is the first phase of public input. We're going to be using this input to draft recommendations, of which we'll share at the end of summer, early fall, with the goal of coming out with a final plan by the end of the calendar year. That is the end of my talking for the evening. Want to make sure we're reminding folks that we're collecting surveys at ridedart.com/plan. And want to see if there's any other reactions or questions.